Welcome to the Fed to Fed podcast, where we dive into the dynamic world of government technology. In this podcast series, we'll be joined by current and former federal leaders and industry trailblazers who are at the forefront of innovation. Here, we speak openly and honestly about the challenges and opportunities facing the federal government and the Department of Defense and its partners in the modern age, driving innovation and the incredible capabilities of technology along the way. Whether you're a federal leader, a tech industry professional, or simply fascinated by IT modernization, just like us, this podcast is for you. And we're so happy to have you tuning in.
Welcome to today's Fed to Fed episode, where we'll be taking a closer look at one of the most disruptive cyber incidents in recent healthcare history, the Change Healthcare attack, and what it means for federal healthcare organizations like the Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm joined by Errol Weiss, Chief Security Officer of Health ISAC, along with Nick Grandis from Rubrik's Federal Team, who supports the VA. Together, we break down what went wrong, why outdated systems amplified the attack, and what healthcare organizations must do now to strengthen resilience. Let's jump in. Nick Grandis, Errol Weiss, welcome to this episode of the Fed to Fed podcast. We're so excited to get perspective from both of you. Take it away, Nick.
Thanks, Susan. Earl, I'm super excited to sit down with you today and really take a look at the Change Healthcare incident that happened back in 2024. I think many folks view this ultimately as a supply chain attack, a supply chain compromise against many both federal and private sector healthcare institutions. But I wanted to peel back the layers a little bit with you today and take a step deeper on what we believe to be some of the lessons that are still left to be learned here. And Earl, let's start here. Can you briefly outline what happened in the Change Healthcare attack and ultimately why it hit the healthcare system so hard?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Nick. And yeah, great to be here with you all. That Change Healthcare incident was just so much more than a supply chain attack. And I think if we start to look at that initial compromise, we're talking about Russian ransomware ultimately that was able to get into the systems and start causing the devastation that happened. And digging into it a little bit, the malicious actors were able to get username and passwords. They found a system that wasn't well protected by multi-factor authentication or MFA. So they were literally able to log into the systems and begin their initial attack. Once they were inside, they were able to move laterally across other systems and continue to compromise more and more systems internally. We see that kind of methodology happen quite a bit when malicious actors are on the inside of the systems at that point. The lateral movement, moving around and compromising more and more systems. From an impact standpoint, we saw delays in prior authorizations and people having trouble filling prescriptions once the Change Healthcare system started going down. But ultimately, the impact was so severe because Change Healthcare is such an integral part of the U.S. healthcare system, including payments and insurance claim administration as well. And they process over 15 billion healthcare transactions annually. They touch about over 100 million patient records every year as well. And so after those systems went down over the next couple of days, as organizations, as healthcare providers like hospitals and clinics were not able to timely file insurance claims, it forced many providers and other practices to suspend claim submissions. And they also were even struggling to verify patient eligibility for certain procedures. So now we've got procedures canceled or rescheduled because the system's not being available. And worse yet, as time went on here in the next couple of days, as those organizations, the hospitals and clinics were not able to file insurance claims, now they're not getting revenue. And suddenly there's a cash flow problem. And now they're having trouble paying their bills, literally. Buying supplies, paying staff to come to work. And so we even heard about small hospitals, rural hospitals, small clinics potentially having to shut their doors because they were not able to continue operation. Backing up and looking at things, that attack has cost United Health Group more than $2 billion, and that was with a B. And ultimately, really, to put this all into perspective, it's not just an IT problem. It really became a patient safety issue as well.
Yeah, there's a few things that really stick with me in your synopsis there, Earl. I think attackers are no longer trying to kick down the front door. You called out credential compromise in gaining access to these critical systems. And you also called out, and we see this in the congressional testimony, where they talk about legacy or outdated systems. How did outdated systems make this attack worse? And in particular, what can large healthcare organizations like the Department of Veterans Affairs take from this?
Right. Yeah, and we see so many environments where organizations are literally running their own data center. They haven't yet moved to cloud, and so they're really operating off of older architectures that are poorly segmented. We're not forcing the network segmentation like we are today and keeping critical assets away from other parts of the network. And as these systems grow and grow, these IT stacks are ultimately very fragile. So one change, one update could potentially cause ripple effects that no one thought about further down in the operation. And again, with that poor segmentation, now it allowed the threat actors to move even more freely across that system once they started getting in and planting ransomware and malware on the inside of the networks. And so as we saw, that meant that what was happening was not only was the primary system being attacked, but the backup recovery system, which was not properly segmented, was also attacked and also taken out. So primary and backup gone, systems completely out. And as we saw, it took months for United Health Group to recover and rebuild some of these potentially from scratch because of the widespread impact. So I think for the lessons learned when it comes to operating these large ecosystems, the consolidation risk is something that the system architects really need to take into consideration, right? There's budget pressures to consolidate IT infrastructure, make things more simple, but that in of itself is very difficult. And so I think the key lessons are that if we're trying to do this consolidation and we maybe inadvertently create these single points of failure, and in my opinion, your crown jewels need to be redundant and resilient. So it's sort of, there's that balance between consolidation versus resilience. And then in this drive to modernization, we need to make sure that we're designing in effective network segmentation and MFA enforcement on all of the external access points, as we saw that was really brutalized in this attack. So I'll leave it there on those two.
No, I mean, I think that's right on the nose, frankly. This breach exposed gaps that exist in many of our nation's healthcare organizations, both public and private. And I think in particular, the resilience of those backup systems that enable organizations to recover quickly and safely. But Earl, why in some instances do basics like this get missed, even in the most mature cybersecurity, cyber posture organizations?
Yeah, it's one of the classic issues that we have in cybersecurity, where there's a focus on compliance and not necessarily a focus on security. And what I mean by that is that the majority of the resources, even in these mature programs that you referenced, the majority of the resources are focused on prevention, implementing things like firewalls or endpoint detection, or even having teams that are doing threat hunting, and not necessarily focused on resilience. So during these widespread outages, how do we ensure that we're able to respond and recover quickly? And just to bring up another example that just had widespread ramifications globally was that faulty CrowdStrike update a few months later in July of 24, where we just saw systems blue screening all over the globe, and suddenly systems were out, and we had major impact across many different critical infrastructures because of that reliance on those systems. So I think that's part of it. And then the other piece here is that the bad guys have also figured out, as they are trying to maximize their ransomware payouts, they've realized that if they can deliberately target the backup systems and make them useless, they know that if they can get in and start encrypting the production data and destroy the backups, they're virtually guaranteed a ransom payout. So certainly part of the strategy as well when it comes to ransomware. The last part I'll mention here too is on, I've talked a bit about complexity already, but I do want to talk about data immutability and the idea about ensuring that the data can't be changed, can't be deleted, and the idea about ensuring that that system is architected into the design from day one, so that we're not susceptible to those kinds of attacks, and hopefully rendering things like ransomware or malware useless.
So, Earl, then what can healthcare organizations do to take that step towards ensuring fast recovery and stronger data resilience in the event of an attack?
Yeah, I've mentioned a few of these things, but really pulling it all together, I think we need that shift to zero trust resilience. That whole concept about treating the idea that, hey, a breach is inevitable, it's going to happen. So we need to focus on defending the data itself. And so if we've got this notion of zero trust data resilience coming in, the data is not just backed up, but it's also secured and in alignment with those sorts of principles. We talked a little bit about immutability, but mandating immutable backups. You mentioned earlier in our pre-discussions that it's table stakes, and I agree. It's non-negotiable. I mean, the data's got to be stored in a way that once it's written, it can't be changed. It's encrypted. It can't be encrypted by anybody else. It can't be deleted by anybody else. The ransomware can't do anything with it, and it can't be compromised by an administrator either. So that's a key aspect of future architectures as well. The air gapping or the logical separation of the production, the backup recovery systems, again, another concept that we need to be careful about and ensure that a threat actor who's moving laterally through the network cannot get from production to recovery. And again, a key part of the architecture going forward.
Yeah, to harken back to something what you said earlier, we see in the space that threat actors are coming after backups as their first step almost 90% of the time. So just like you said, compromising those gives them control. Now, Earl, talk to me about the importance of better information sharing across healthcare and federal agencies to, in the future, really help limit the impact of another Change Healthcare type event.
Yeah, I've been involved with ISACs for a long time, since really they were first around in 1999 at this point. And the whole idea here is it's an information sharing analysis center. And I really equate it to a virtual neighborhood watch program. So if you see some new threat, new vulnerability, an attack, or you have information on an incident, and you can share that information with the rest of the community, everybody else can use that to check their own house, check their systems. Are they vulnerable to that kind of an attack? Have they ever seen that kind of an attack? Or have they even been the potential victim of that kind of an attack, and be able to look for those things inside their environments? And right after the Change Healthcare incident broke in February of 24, our members or organizations were actively sharing information with each other that we knew about the attack. Change Healthcare was also quick to share information about what happened and what their initial attack vectors were thought to be. And I think most importantly, what recommendations did they have about organizations that were electronically connected to them through B2B or B2C type connections, and what to do next. And I think that was really important in terms of making sure that systems were still up and processes were still running, and just a really huge, important part of the recovery throughout the whole ecosystem. The other thing I want to add in there too is that while we've got great coverage in hospitals, healthcare providers, and many of the subsectors across healthcare globally, we always have difficult problem getting to the last mile that I talk about here, where it's all of the suppliers, the key aspects of your supply chain, the small rural hospitals, for example, and others that might not be as well connected or as mature from a cybersecurity standpoint. And how do we reach all of them? So it's a challenge that we all have, and it's something that when we talk about cybersecurity being a team sport, we need to think about those partners. We need to think about how to reach all of them. And then the final point here that I want to bring up too is just a really wonderful resource that the Health Sector Coordinating Council Cybersecurity Working Group, there's a mouthful, that organization came and developed a what they are calling the Health Industry Cybersecurity Sector Mapping and Risk Toolkit, or SMART for short. And it's a free resource. I'll provide a link here for the podcast and make it available to the listeners here. But the idea here is that they have, right after the Change Healthcare incident, and again, taking so many people by surprise about how much of a critical single point of failure source that organization was in the whole healthcare ecosystem, they use that to study the health ecosystem in the US and look at the process flows, the workflows, the data flows for key critical processes across that whole entire ecosystem, and mapped it all out. And so you can look at that map, figure out how it fits in your own environment, take a look at where those critical points are, maybe the single points of failure are, and use those to do your own risk assessment and help come up with mitigating controls and plans that you can use in your own organization. So highly recommend that to folks as well to check that out.
Excellent recommendations, Earl. I think starting with those resources is a fantastic place to take that next step in maturity from a cyber resiliency posture standpoint. And ultimately, it comes back to a lot of the things that we talked about, right? Can the data survive an attack? Number one, it's ultimately table stakes. If there's nothing to recover from, protracted downtime leads to negative healthcare impacts, regardless of public or private sector. And then making sure that you can actually recover in a clean and confident state is really the next step. The speed between those things is ultimately the major variable that leads to a cyber attack being a blip on the radar or a long, protracted, weeks, months-long event like we saw in the Change Healthcare incident. So thank you all very much for listening. Earl, thank you so much for your time. This was a fantastic conversation. I hope we can do it again, my friend.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate the time here.
This concludes today's episode of the Fed to Fed podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us continue bringing you thought-provoking conversations with the brightest minds in government technology. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will continue to explore opportunities to harness the power of technology and explore what's next in developing a more innovative and efficient government. Until then, this is the Fed to Fed podcast by GovTech Connects. Thank you for joining us.